Hello everyone, this is Damon with PixMap Software. For this video, I'm going to be discussing the new perspective scaling option for Easy Team Builder 2.5. Now there are 7 different levels you can use the perspective scaling, and you can also leave it off as well. So right now we're looking at level 3, and it does taper the size down for the players from one row to the next. And it also decreases the spacing between each player, or it maintains the same spacing with relationship to the size of the player. I'm just going to scroll through so you can see here. So this is off. This is with no perspective scaling. Then level 1, you see we just get a little bit of it. And as we increase the strength of the perspective scaling all the way up to strength 7, I don't recommend using up to 7. It's usually too much, but I did decide to put in more than is usually needed. That way you're not going to run out of adjustment and want more. And you can see that, let me turn the auto select on. Oh, by the way, if you have the auto select on, wherever you click, it's going to grab that it's going to auto-select the layer that you're clicking on based on the player. So you can see the players in the back row. These actually are the tallest players in the group because it organizes by height, and then it organizes each row by height, with the shortest row being in front and the tallest being in back. At least that's the default option. But as you can see with the perspective scaling up to 7, how much that it's actually scaled down those back rows. And as mentioned, 7 is usually a little bit too strong. And with 7, it even looks like this front row is much too large. I think that's actually an optical illusion here because what's going on is there's more players in this front row. There was 11 players in the front row and only 10 in the second. If I move it to 10 and 10, you can see that the proportions now look more like what they should. But I built it with 11 and then 10 just because when using at the normal strengths, and I recommend 1 to 4 is the normal range to use this at most of the time. The default is 2, by the way. But I'll discuss this, the number per row, toward the end of this video more. But when using them at this strength is why I chose the number per row that I did when I built this. So I'm going to show the strength of 7 again, and then with it off, just so I can show you everything that's happening when the perspective scaling happens. Now again, I wouldn't usually use it at 7, but since this is the maximum adjustment, it'll allow us to more see, or easier, it'll be easier to see what's going on. So you can see the back row, especially the players are scaled way down, but they are also pushed in too. So the row is not as wide because the players are maintaining the same distance between each other with relationship to the size of the player. So it's the same exact thing you'd get from a camera if you were shooting a wide angle lens. If you have a row of 9 people, it's going to take up less of the frame the further they are back in the the further away they are from the camera. So if we move now to where these feet on the bottom line up, you can also see that each row, as it increments up, it's kind of hard to see with both of them together there, but the more perspective scaling you use, the shorter the overall build is going to be because it has to decrease the row spacing gradually as it goes up each row so that it's proportional to the player sizing. There's actually a lot of math that's going on here. I had to break out the 8th grade algebra when I did this. All right, so before I go into the actual software to show you the adjustments, the other thing I was going to talk about, so if you build this, let's go up to somewhere like 5, for example, here. It's going to try to get the rows more or less aligned like you want them. However, if you do want to make adjustments, if you want to adjust an entire row, select the row you want, and it's the layer group. And then make sure the auto select is off, because if it's on, as I mentioned before, it's going to grab wherever you click and select that player. So select the whole group and make sure this is off, and then you can adjust each individual row where you want. Now, if you think that the row spacing is too much and you're having to move all of these, as I am here, because it just depends on how you want to build them. But if you want to build these closer together, there is an adjustment for that in the software where I'll show you where you can have it automatically build with them more on top of each other. All right, so let's jump into the software now. Before I do that, I'm going to throw a bunch of these layers away. And that is because it takes a long time to load the software. Well, not a long time, but a lot longer to actually load the software than normal if you have like 300 or 400 layers like we had there with all of those. And I would never recommend actually building a team if you've already got a team in there. It's going to slow the software down, and I don't even know if it'll work right if there's two of them in there, because it's going to try to create duplicate layer names. But just so I can open it up and explain things while we're looking at it, that's why I did that. So the perspective scaling here, this is the adjustment that I was showing with the different levels. So 0 is off, and you can go up to 7. You can't go in between. I wanted to make it so you could go in between like 5.5, but there was just too much math involved because it wasn't one single adjustment. There was actually several nonlinear algebra equations I had to put together for all the different adjustments this makes. So there's just 7 distinct levels you can run this at. And like I say, 2 to 4, or 1 to 4, excuse me, is usually the range. And if you hit reset to default, you'll see the default is 2 on that. And when you saw I was moving all of the rows down, that actually, the spacing between rows, if you want less, you can decrease that. And this adjustment, I'll try to give it a brief explanation, but the spacing between, like from the top of one head to the top of the next, if this is set to 1.5 by default, that is going to be 1.5 average head heights. But you might see more, like for example in this top row, that's because that is not accounting for the height of the player too. So you're going to get 1.5 head heights, plus if you go up higher height from one row to the next, you're going to get the additional extra height of the players. That's if you're aligned by feet, you'll get that. Not if you're aligned by face, but if you're aligned by feet, you'll get that. So you may see more than 1.5 depending on how different the players are in height from one row to the next. But in any case, if you want to change that, just lower that, and it's going to put them all closer together. Or if you wanted to make them further apart, you could increase that. But in the example we did, we made them closer together. Also, since I'm here looking at it, when I built this team, I used 45 for the player scaling. Now that's the player scaling for each individual player. And I'm not going to get into details in this video because I discussed this in another video. But just to briefly explain, if you lower that, that's going to maintain the same spacing between faces for all the players. But what that will do is decrease the overall size of every player in the whole group. So it's going to give them more spacing. So it's going to make everybody smaller with more spacing if you go lower. And with football players with shoulder pads, I usually like to go about 45. 50 is the default, and 50 is set up to more or less be shoulder to shoulder from person to person, but that's not accounting for shoulder pads with the football players. So with football, 45 is usually a good number. I think the last thing I'll discuss is the number per row, since I was discussing that earlier in this video. So it's going to give you default numbers, but you can change these. A lot of people don't realize that you don't have to use the numbers it gives you. You don't even have to use the number of rows it gives you. We've got 51 players. I could tell it to put 26 in row 1 and 25 in row 2 and only use 2 rows. It's completely up to you. When I built this for this demonstration, I actually did change this. I went 11, 10, 11, 10, and then 9. With doing perspective scaling, I found that it usually looks good if you, from the third row from the top up to the top row, if you can do it, decrease by 1 each time. So going from 11 here to 10 to 9, that gives a nice taper to the top and kind of gives more of the perspective look. And the same thing with the bottom. Going from 10 to 11 gives it a slight taper on the bottom. Now this does too depend on the level of perspective scaling you're using and also the overall look you're going for. And when it puts these in by the default, it tries to keep all the rows close to the same value and only change by 1 each row where it can. In the top row, the defaults did change by 2 because it can't always just change by 1. It just depends on how many players are going in and how many rows it's building. But do feel free to adjust these as you want for your images. There's no rules to how you have to align these, so don't think you have to use what it gives you. The only thing is you have to make sure that you have the number per row. The total has to equal the total number of images you have. So it's going to tell you down here. So as you change these, it's going to tell you how many you have assigned to rows and how many images are in the folder. And if you try to build and those don't equal, it's going to tell you you don't have all the images assigned. So you have to adjust these until you have, in this case, 51 images assigned, and then it's going to know how to build the whole team. Not going to hit continue because I don't need to start the build process. I'm just going to hit escape here. So that covers, I guess, everything I want to talk about the perspective scaling. I probably talked longer than I really needed to because this is actually pretty basic. There's not a whole lot to it. The main thing you need to know is the default level is 2, which is here. If you want to turn it off, turn that number to 0 and you'll have it off. If you want to go higher, turn it up. And then you can adjust rows as needed by unchecking this auto select and then moving your rows around. And if you want to adjust a player. Oh, while I'm thinking about this too, I don't think I mentioned this, but if you want to move players around after you've built this, you turn the auto select on. If you're moving them between rows, you are going, let me go to mode 7 because that's the most extreme. So if you're moving these between rows, you can really see that when we went to the top row on the perspective mode 7. But you're going to lose the proportions. They're not going to be correct if you're going from one row to the next because it's adjusted this image for row 5, and if we put it in row 1, you see it's much too small. So it's best to know how many you want per row and only adjust images within the same row, because you can move these around within the same row all you want and you're not going to lose the proportions. Now if you think you may go between rows, there is an option in the software. Go back in here real quick. Now it's taken a while now because now I'm showing all 300 and some layers, and so it's looking for the easy team layer. Alright, so when we go back in here, there is the option for using smart objects. This will give you a warning basically saying it could crash your Photoshop, because if you're using smart objects, it's going to use the full image size is going to be stored within the Photoshop document. So if you're shooting a 50 megapixel camera, every single player is going to have a 50 megapixel document stored within there. So if your computer can handle it, Up to maybe 20 or 30 is usually not a problem, but if you go higher, it's just depends on what your computer can handle. But if you do use smart objects, the scaling is non-destructive, so you can scale up without losing detail, which was the point I was trying to get to. That's up to you if you want to try that or not. But usually when using the multi-row, you don't want to use the smart objects. And so just try to make sure that you get the number per row correct so you don't have to rescale any images. One thing I may do for a future release I've thought about, I probably will eventually, is have a third option. So right now there's smart objects on or off. I would actually like to have a smart object mode that's not full resolution smart objects. So for example, it has to scale these down to fit the template, but maybe have the smart objects be, 20% taller. So instead of being this height, have them maybe 20% taller than they are or so, and then save them all in smart objects that way. That way it does give you some room to scale up or down, and you're not going to have to worry about losing detail if you have to scale back up. But it won't have to store the full 50 megapixel file if that's what you're shooting. It's only going to store just a little bit higher resolution than needed to put into the template. So look for that update maybe sometime in the future, but as of now, it's either smart objects full resolution or no smart objects at all. So again, I probably talked for probably longer than I should have, but hopefully that answers all of your questions for the perspective scaling. And if you're interested at all in Easy Team Builder and you haven't tried it, please be sure to visit our website. That is pixnub.com.